One of the things that I feel are very important that we bring back for women's health are Sitz Baths. Sitz Baths were a part of medical practice. In fact, 40 years ago when I had my son, I had him in the hospital. I was right at that brink of home birth. You know, if he'd come 2 years later, I would have had him at home, but it was right at that time. And so I was having him in the hospital, and they still gave you Sitz Baths, really big things that you could put your whole butt in and soak. And today they still do them in hospitals, but they're like little half-moon plastic things. Nobody's butt could fit in them. It's like, I don't know what they think is going to go in there, maybe the baby's tush, but nonetheless, Sitz Baths are really important for a whole variety of things. One thing is they're just a nice way to make your whole pelvic area feel. So for instance, you can just use them if you feel kind of drained pelvically, you know, like when I think of our pelvic, I think of this as kind of where our creative juices, not just our baby drives and, you know, not just our eggs, but our entire creative juices flow up from the pelvis. And to give you an example of that is when your pelvis is mildly warm and the juices are still flowing well, there's kind of this vivaciousness. You feel like spring is happening in your body, right? And that, by the way, doesn't have to stop when you get in menopause. You know, I always say it's like you have a little tiny flashlight, a little coal. It's just a little bright light, not like raging. That's too much fire. But it's like a little light, and you beam it out on the world, and it's coming from down there to down there, and everything looks sensuous, not sexual, sensuous, beautiful, and kind of turns you on, so that you're excited about life. And that's the point, that's that place where your dreams are flowing. So it may not just be dreams about having babies or family or, you know, men or women, but it's just kind of like there's a juiciness in your body and it's yours. It's your juiciness. So when that energy gets tired, it gets tired for all kinds of reasons. Sometimes it's congestion, sometimes it's terrible infections, sometimes it's bad relationships, sometimes it's a hard time at work, sometimes there's just too many kids and too much to do and you're just worn out. But when that starts to drain, everything kind of drains with it. And you do feel dry. You feel dried up. I'm not talking here about age-related problems. I'm just talking about, so Sitz Baths bring all the blood flow to your pelvic. And they kind of get the little coal going. They light the coal. And they bring blood. And they bring energy. And it makes you think about down there. Ooh, I've been ignoring down there. You know, you start thinking about it a little bit. And then you get out of the tub, and you have your little flashlight turned on again. So Sitz Baths are just good for that. They were also used whenever there is congestion or blockages. And I would say things like fibroids and cysts they can be used for too. When you have inflammatory problems, like if you have a really raging infection, I wouldn't recommend that you do them unless you are a practitioner, because you bring all that heat to the pelvis and you can accentuate that infection. That can be a really good thing if you know what you're doing. But if you don't, so if you have raging infections, you might not want to use Sitz Baths. But for every other, you know, if there's for fibroids and cysts and blockages and congestion, for delayed menstrual cycles, for lack of energy, for abuse issues, where oftentimes when women have had abuse, the light turns off kind of permanently. They might even be really young. They might have lots of juices flowing, but that sense of excitement that permeates from the pelvic region of your body has been damaged. And so there really isn't sensation. There's not a sense of vitality. So Sitz Baths can really be good for that. Put a little ginger in the bath, not too much, a little ginger. Gets that warming going. So it can be used for all of those kinds of things. And very effective. It can be very effective for those. So the way traditionally Sitz Baths were used is you have a good size, what would I want to call it, a tush tub, a butt tub, you know, big enough that you can comfortably put your pelvic area in with your arms and legs out. They used to have them, actually, sometimes if you go to old pharmacy museums or else sometimes in antique stores, you'll see a strange looking bathtub, or it looks almost like an ash bucket, you know, like a big ash bucket, so that it looks like your butt fits in and your arms and legs fit out. This is where you want to concentrate the heat. It's just in your pelvic area. At home, I usually pull my tubs out. I have 2 tubs for this. And I use tubs that I get at the feed stores, okay, or garden supplies. So rubber, not metal, because metal can be very uncomfortable, and even with the hot water burn. And you need 2 of them. So those big rubber buckets that they use for feed, being cows and chickens and stuff. So you go into your local feed store in Barrie, Vermont, where I live, and I look at the buckets and I look at my butt. Perfect. And the feed store men are just looking at me. Anyway, so nice big rubber buckets are great. You can also get them at household supply places too. You need two because you're going to do hot and cold. Okay. So because what you're doing is you're doing you're doing hydrotherapy, applications of hot, really, really, really hot, and really cold. And so what I usually do is I will fill up my cold bucket first, and I do this in the bathtub. And by the way, just to let you know, this whole process can take 20 minutes and be totally not messy. You know, I really, everything that I've done herbally, I find ways that it's still really effective, but simple and not really messy. Fewer dishes, the better, you know, the fewer pots and pans. So here, one bucket under the cold water, and I usually just turn on cold. I just blast the cold. If you, first time ever doing it, you might want to put a little tepidness in there, but you want it really cold. And I pull that to the back of the tub. And then in the front of the tub, I put my formulas, like let's say I'm working with cysts or fibroids, or if I do work with infections, I'll put some, like I said, not to do it if you have a raging infection unless you know what you do, but if somebody has an infection, I'll put like some infection-fighting herbs, maybe a little Oregon grapefruit or a little golden seal in there, or it can be raspberry if you have leukorrhea or a discharge. So you put your formula in. It can be in a bag or it can be powdered, and you turn that hot water on as hot as you can stand it without burning your skin. So it has to be really hot. You don't want to get a burn, but it needs to be really hot. So really hot, really cold. And so how many of you have done Sitz Baths before? See your hands up. Oh, a bunch of you. Oh my goodness. So I'm going to finish sharing this because some of you haven't. So what I do is I plunge into the cold and I count really rapidly to like 10, you know, fast. And then when I can't stand it anymore, I plunge into the hot. And the hot doesn't feel super hot to me now because I've been in the cold. So I stay in the hot for a few minutes and then I go back to the cold. In some books, when they give the instructions, they'll say precise amounts of time in the hot and cold. But I'm just not the kind of herbalist who works that way, and nature never works that way, and plants never work that way. I don't think, unless you're really Virgo, you don't need to have your clock out going, tick, time to jump. So what I usually use is just you stay in the cold as long as you can until it's, you know, you can't stand it, and then into the warm. And usually you go back and forth about 7 to 8 times, and then you finish with the cold. You have to finish with a cold plunge, so that way the blood isn't all focused on the surface of the skin, but it's drawn more deeper into the deeper organs. So what you've done is you've just done this physical manipulation of blood flow to your pelvis, constricting, blood flow to the pelvis, constricting, and blood circulating is like rivers of life just flowing through there. And so it's a really good way to activate and to break up blockages and to work with fibroids and cysts. And I didn't want to imply that you can't use it for infections, for raging infections. I just think it's really important that you have good counsel when you do, because too much heat in the pelvis, inflammation is already heat, so you just want to have good counsel when you're doing that. So the Sitz Baths need to come back. You know, they were used when women gave birth because of the soreness oftentimes, and sometimes the tearing. And so it was very soothing, and it brought blood flow. And midwives and herbalists would put herbs like Comfrey in. Is this the community that still uses Comfrey, or is everybody here terrified of Comfrey? Oh, good. You've had good educators. Great. I always use the Comfrey question as a barometer to tell about what level of depth people have with plants. It doesn't, you know, I want to share this, that I actually have to say that I don't think anybody really has the final answer. If you absolutely knew, then, you know. But what I know for myself, I always say I just want to go down in history as having been an advocate for Comfrey, but I don't ever try to pretend like I have the final information on it. All I have is, you know, the empirical evidence, my own personal use, looking at the studies that were irrelevant. But nonetheless, with all of that, there's never ever been any study that says it's unsafe to use it topically, so people thankfully are still using it topically. So Comfrey is great for tears and wounds and cuts, any kind of inflammation in the pelvic area. So Do you want to go over a couple formulas that you might use just so you have them? So for inflammation or irritation, where if you've had irritation to the pelvic area, a good mucilaginous formula would be Comfrey and a little raspberry. Raspberry is an astringent, but it also is a mucilage. It has mucilaginous properties in it. So it'd be Comfrey and raspberry and maybe just a couple tiny little drops of lavender oil in there. But you can just even use Comfrey by itself for inflammation and irritation. For infection, like if you have a discharge, raspberry leaf is excellent, and nettle is also good. For more severe cases, you can use a little Oregon grapefruit or golden seal. I still use golden seal a lot in my practice, and still write about it and all of that. People are always shocked because it's one of the at-risk plants, but I just say there's tons of organic farmers growing it. Just buy from organic sources and support the organic growers. I still love that herb, and I use it a lot for irritation to the membranes and infection. It's not so much for irritation, but for infection, it's excellent. So that would be a really good one. And then just for energy, ginger. A ginger sitz bath is really great. It brings heat and warmth to the pelvic area. I use ginger a lot energetically and physiologically for issues with the pelvic area for women's health. There's a lot of organic golden seal available, so there really is no reason that we should be supporting wild harvested. And I want to qualify that and say that there are always farmers and growers who maintain a lot of integrity with their wild stands and go out and have lived on their land a long time and still dig it and sell it. That's very different if you know the person who's wildcrafted it. So it's not like, no, you can't use it from wild sources. It's just knowing. I would never buy it without knowing the farmer and his relationship with his wild stand. So, okay, so sitz baths are really good.